Hello everyone. In this chess video we're going to discuss this double fianchetto setup and something like this here. It can be done with both sides and essentially why I think this is actually positionally flawed. Now before we can analyze this, I'm going to go to a similar position here, but I'm going to simplify it so we can look at one side here. So if we were to have this double fianchetto, black would have like some setup over here, maybe white would have some setup over on this side. But here I just broke it down into parts so you could look at what a better setup would be. Because right now I just want to focus on just what one fianchetto setup looks like for each side, and then show why two for the same color might not be as advantageous. So here, if we were to look, both sides are pretty solid. This is a really optimal setup, and specifically the coordination between the bishops and the knights. In this case, there's only one bishop because there's only a fianchetto and the knights here. So this is actually what both sides want. This is a really good positional setup. And the reason for that has to do with what squares these pieces are controlling. Now obviously there'd be many more pieces on the chessboard. I simplified the position by taking away all the rooks and the queens and whatever other details that we don't really need, just focusing on the setup. So with this fianchetto setup, which is this little pawn formation, this little triangle thing here, and then the bishop guarding the squares that the pawns do not. Same thing over here, you got this little pawn hat, sometimes people call it. I've also heard it called a sniper's nest. I've heard this called a lot of different things. And then of course the bishop that helps control the squares that these pawns do not. So this is the fianchetto setup by itself, which is okay. It's got its pros and cons to it, but having two of the same for each color probably isn't too good. And so here's why. With this bishop, if we just look at it like only white's perspective, this bishop is influencing the long diagonal. And specifically the central squares this bishop is controlling is d4 and e5. And so white's bishop is doing a pretty good job. And of course white's bishop also controls this square, and it's doing a lot. Now, some players might be thinking, well, isn't this knight blocking the bishop? Like, wouldn't this bishop rather be controlling these squares, and it's not quite yet? Well, sort of yes and sort of no. Because it only takes one knight move, knight to d1 or knight to a4 or somewhere, and then all of a sudden there'll be this scope over these squares. And so because this is like, poised to, do whatever they like, it keeps them really flexible. And so even though this knight is temporarily in the way of the bishop, as far as what squares are controlled go, I could say this bishop is already ready to control these central squares. And so if the bishop is controlling these central dark squares, because it is a dark squared bishop, then what we actually want is we want our other pieces, whether it be the bishop, other bishop, maybe the knights, maybe the queen or rooks. In this case, we're going to focus on the knights, but we want them to control the squares of the other color complex. Because if we were to look at it, this dark squared bishop can never leave the dark squares. And if we had a light squared bishop, it can never leave the light squares. And so this bishop cannot switch roles. It must control dark squares. So, of course, it's already doing that. It's influencing a good portion of the center here. But what it cannot do is control light squares. And so how can we control light squares? Specifically, squares like this. Put them in blue here. And how can we control both of these squares? Well, we can actually control those squares with the knight. And this is why the knight, just barely in front of the bishop here, even though it looks like it's blocking it, together they control a really large portion of the center. Now, the reason I put this other knight here, this knight on e2, is to illustrate the fact that this is a really good location for this knight, because if this knight were to be traded off at some point, we could always recapture it. Another benefit of having this knight here is that if I was to move it a little bit and just put it on f3, we'll notice this knight is a bit redundant over here, because what is this knight actually controlling? Well, it's actually controlling these dark squares. And ignoring this knight here, we have this bishop also controlling these very same dark squares. And so it's almost as if the bishop and the knight are over-influencing one color complex and then leaving all of the rest completely vulnerable. And if you want to maybe gang up on a target, if you want to have some weakness in your opponent's camp, you're trying to overload, something like that, then yes, by all means, you can, reinforce and, gang up on and completely overload that one square. But for the most part, like here, this center is something that we want to control entirely, and so it's better to have all your pieces working together to control many things at once, and not so much focused on one square and then leave other targets undefended. So a much better idea here is to have your knights kind of like this, and your bishop, fianchetto, if you have this setup. Now, for black's perspective, it's the exact same thing. I just put it for black's perspective. This would be a really optimal setup for black if they were to play one fianchetto formation. Now, a little trivia interesting thing is actually the plural for fianchetto is fianchetti. Instead of an O at the end, it's an I. But that's more of a trivia thing. Almost never does that actually come up because most chess openings do not have both fianchetto setup played on each side. But okay, let's go back to this position here. And so this is the one that we were looking at earlier. And so obviously I only did one side here. When I actually set this up, I actually forgot to put the kings on the board, and then the analysis board had an illegal position and wouldn't let me set it up. Kind of funny. So I did have to include the kings. But here, let's take a look at the double fianchetto setup. So here, black has played this Fianchetti formation, and perhaps a little too ambitious. I don't really think it's positionally sound, because here's the problem. This side looks really good. They have this formation with these pawns and the bishop. Looks okay. This knight is really well placed because here this bishop is controlling the key dark squares, and this knight is controlling these key light squares. And so together they do a really good job at helping control everything in the center. And with this influence, black has a really good stronghold on the center. And even better, this knight might even recapture if this knight is ever lost on f6. So they're doing a lot of things. Now, with that being said, this means black's kingside fianchetto setup is pretty good. However, the problem is we look at this setup on the queen side. And while this knight is actually misplaced, because if we were to imagine it, this knight would much rather be here, and we would much rather have the other knight, this f6 knight, back here on e7. And so that means that although the kingside setup looks good, the queenside setup isn't really optimal. And if we were to imagine it flipped, the same thing, this knight could be here, this knight could be here, but then the knights are not here at this location. And so you really can't have both. So I feel like by doing this double Fianchetti thing, you're really overestimating, what you can actually, get. It's kind of like you're biting off more than you can chew. And I know a lot of people think, well, bishops, they look good on long diagonals. And yes, but they seem to be competing with each other. They're not really working together. And so this is the reason that this isn't really an optimal setup. It's very difficult to exploit this in a game. There are ways that you could do that. And I might even make a future video because I have at least one game I recall specifically where I really did really well in that game. The setup really was unsound and I really crushed it, all of modesty aside there. And they really didn't do much wrong. But my opponent did try this double Fianchetti setup and they really got punished for it. So maybe as an instructional game I could show that game in the future, but I don't want to make this video too long. I wanted to more show the introductory concepts to why this setup is bad, and then maybe in a future video I could look at deeper details on how I actually took advantage of it in a game, because there's a lot of nuances that we could get into there. Now, before we go and end the video, I just want to bring up an opening example, just for argument's sake, now that we have more pieces in the game, and just to show what one Fianchetto setup would look like, and not two, and show what a good optimal setup would be. So here we'll look at it from black's perspective. So I'll flip the board. And so we're going to look at an opening variation in the King's Indian, on King's Indian defense because we're black. So we'll have white play d4, we have knight f6, c4, g6 is the King's Indian type thing. We're going to fianchetto one fianchetto. We're not going to try this fianchetti thing because this is probably positionally unsound. So we have this fianchetto here, e4, d6, still opening theory here. f3 is the same-ish variation. Knight f3 instead would be the regular main line. We have castles, bishop e3, just developing move, and then we'll just play a casual move like say a6, which is thematic to this opening, but it's not the only move to play. Other opening ideas are e5 or c5, mostly for black. But a6 is also a very flexible move that is very commonly played in this opening, and this is still opening theory. Say white just develops, and now here, let's say we didn't know opening theory and we have no idea what to do. Well, of course, if you do know theory, you would be tempted to play these thematic pawn breaks, a move like this, but let's say you don't. You're just following opening principles, you're just playing a decent position. Can we still play a really good move and, perhaps even the best move without actually knowing these? And the answer is yes. We'll look at our Fianchetto setup here, and we'll realize that our bishop is controlling some nice central squares, specifically these squares in the center. And this knight is also optimally placed in that we're also influencing the other color complex. So here, if we want to develop our pieces, like opening principles, and we want to develop our other knight, then where would that knight actually be best located? And the answer to that is, well, d7, because then it can help reinforce this knight. And on at least a short, small depth analysis here, short depth, knight b to d7 is the best move. Right now it's fluctuating a bit, saying that c6 is very similar. Looks like b5 is similar now, it's running a little bit deeper. But this is one of the top moves here, and it's to no surprise that this is also a book move. And so even if you don't know opening theory, sometimes you can kind of reason through the position, and you'll end up finding the best moves, because this is a really good optimal setup for one side playing this fianchetto. Now, maybe in a future video, like I said, we could show a little deeper into this double fianchetti and how to exploit it, but this would probably be not so good for black for the reasons that we mentioned earlier. It's just too overestimating, just too ambitious. You're trying to control too much of the center and the long diagonal, but you're not really understanding how pieces coordinate, specifically the bishops and the knights. So I hope everyone found this video useful, and as usual, as I often say, I will see you in the next video.